Martha Ann Boyd.
And I'm Vant Hardaway.
Right now my profession is retired. Retired, community service, all that good stuff. But formerly I was employed with Olin, then Arch Chemicals, and my last position with them was managing the pool care hotline, customer service. Yes.
Okay, my question for my career currently also is that I am retired from a full-time career after 38 years in education and pastoral work. I had over 30 years of pastoral work, but right now I am, I guess I'd say I'm a public servant following in other areas. I do serve in the community as a chaplain for Star Regional Hospital, and I also work with CASA as a mentoring specialist with that CASA, Court-Appointed Special Advocates, and other things, whatever the community needs me to do. And I follow, as I said, Ms. Boyd in customer service.
I was born in Etowah, Tennessee, McMinn County, in 1950.
I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, 1950. I was born there, so where I am now, we moved here later, but I was born in Birmingham. It was different. In Birmingham, Alabama, and I'll probably interject quickly here, we got to Tennessee because my father was a pastor and a minister. So because of moving to Athens, Tennessee to serve in the pastorate, so the children followed along. So I moved when I was 6. I turned 7 the year we moved. It was during the summer. And so it was a transition because we came to a church and some people there we knew, but it was a transition to also with school when I came. I came in 1950s. We really didn't have kindergarten, but I'd gone to first grade in Birmingham. So when coming from Birmingham to here, and coming to the Athens, Tennessee segregated school, and it was segregated in Birmingham as well, but I think our schools there was a little bit farther ahead.
I grew up in Etowah, attended school at, we called it Hartstown School. It was formerly a Rosenwald school, but when they tore it down, they built another school, and we just called it Hartstown. But then in the mid-50s, they built a school which was incorporated East Etowah and West Etowah. There was the town was split by the railroad tracks, and they consolidated the schools, not incorporated, but they consolidated those two schools, and it became East West Etowah Grammar School. And I started in that little school. I was supposed to be in the second grade, but they skipped me over the second grade and put me in the third grade. So that was kind of a big transition, but I was in the same grade as my brother, so there was competition. Yeah. I like that. But I attended that school through the 8th grade. But in attending that school, I walked past a high school right next door to my house. Within a couple of blocks, there was a grammar school that I could have attended. And then another couple of blocks, there was a junior high school that I could have attended if I were white. Yeah. But since I was black, I had to go past those schools on the bus and go to Hartstown. And then in going to high school, I went to J.L. Cook School, which I think, all in all, was a good school. It was a great school. But in my junior year, my brother had dropped out of school, so I said, I'm not standing out there on the street catching that bus in the cold by myself, so I decided to go to Etowah High School in 1965. So I went there 1 year, and the next year they consolidated Etowah, Inglewood, and the students from Cook High School into one school, the one that you graduated from.
Yeah.
Rosenwald schools were named after Julius Rosenwald, who was the CEO of Sears and Roebuck Company. But he partnered with Booker T. Washington to build those schools because there weren't schools for black kids. They could have been going in a log cabin. Like my mother went in a little raggedy school, one-room school. And Rosenwald schools were defined as different. They had different standards. Like they had windows that were on one side and they faced the sun because there was no electricity and no heat. But the windows gave light during the day and heat also when the sun was shining. But those schools were built, I think there was probably close to 5,000 schools built throughout the South to educate students. And from the first through, some of them were high schools, and most of them were grade schools, but they were built to educate black kids. And those were great schools because they did focus strictly on education. And a lot of people, older than me, actually went to the Rosenwald schools. By the time I was in grade school, they transitioned from that one. But I do have a picture of it. It was a good school.
All right. And how was like the relationships or the connections with other children at those schools?
Other children?
Yeah.
You mean while I was going to school?
Yeah, while you're going to those schools.
Well, unique thing about our family, we lived in the white neighborhood because when Etowah first was founded, there was a lot of black people that owned property in Etowah. J.W. McDermott, which is part of your family, owned a huge part of where downtown Etowah is now. But my dad chose not to sell his property, so we ended up right next to the high school, which is kind of unusual because most of the black people were either in East Etowah or Hartstown and another section of Etowah. But during the week, during the summer and whenever, I played with the kids in the neighborhood, which were traditionally white. But when I went to school, I couldn't wait to get to school, and we would walk to Hartstown to play with black kids. So that was really special for us. And that's part of growing up. Our next door neighbor, sometimes they'd have kids, and I would be fascinated. There was a young girl in the neighborhood that I could play with, I could relate to. But mostly I played with my brothers. Yeah. And they were tomboys. Instead of having a dollhouse for dolls, we would take my doll out and hang it and play cowboys, climb trees, build tree houses. So I was pretty much a tomboy in the neighborhood. But I enjoyed it.
Freehill was an area in Athens it was on the other side of town, away from J.L. Cook School. Now, J.L. Cook School, when I got to Athens in '57, already had elementary school students, and in one part of the building in there was a high school area as well, because from other communities, Etowah and others, when they got to high school, they would go in to feed into J.L. Cook School.
That's when we took the bus.
Yeah, that's when they would take the bus across town. When she mentioned a while ago riding the bus over to Parkstown or wherever you went, I had forgotten about some of those stories.
Yeah.
But for me, in Athens, either our parents had to take us across town to J.L. Cook School, or we would walk. But all the black kids from the Freehill area and some of the other areas, there was a housing development, a public housing development. But we would just walk, and sometimes it would be a large number of us walking over to the location where J.L. Cook School was. And that location is still there, but the school is not. It's J.L. Cook Park. And it's been doing some development by the Cook Foundation as well as some others in the community. And it's still there with a park where you can go and see it, and there's some historical markers there. But we went and we would walk in groups, so, where we would all go to that one school.
And one note, you walk past Forest Hill School, which was
Walk past
all
Forest Hill,
beautiful white school.
Yeah.
But they walked past it to get to Cook.
Yeah.
That's how the segregation was in the South. There was a Langtown school, and it was built on the Rosenwald style. They never declared that it was a Rosenwald school, but it was built on that style. There was Oak Grove, there was Etowah, West Etowah, East Etowah. Riceville, I think, at one time had a school. I'm gonna say Oak Grove,
Yeah,
Langston.
Calhoun, did Calhoun have one? Or was it Calhoun was that?
Calhoun was part of Union School.
Union School,
It was
okay.
the one down at Britain.
Britain, yeah.
But there were several schools that fed into Cook High School, but there were also students that rode a bus from Sweetwater, Lenore City, Loudon to come to Cook High School. And at one point, they had dorms on campus, and those dorms were houses that were given to Cook or to Mr. Nash from Oak Ridge. You know, when they built Oak Ridge, they had houses for the workers to stay in. And those dorms that they had at Cook were those old houses from Oak Ridge. And we found this out later. Harry Blair and I did a lot of research, and we found out they used the houses. But the bus drivers, the one that I remember the most and was probably longest was Ed Simpson. And he lived in Etowah, so he drove the bus around and picked up all the Etowah kids and dropped some off at the West Etowah East and West School or Parkstown School, and then he took the high school students on to Athens to high school. And the same thing in Athens. I'm not sure. One of the first bus drivers was Mr. Matlock, and he lives now on the road that I live on. That we bought property in Riceville. But he would pick up all the students from, say, Calhoun, all down that way, and bring them to Cook High School. But he was one of the first bus drivers. And we got pictures of the first bus. It was a truck with a canvas top. Yeah. So we were determined to get to school. I'm sorry.
Well, the parents were determined for you to get to school because they had to take the initiative to help and make that happen. Yeah.
My mother's maiden name was Dorothy Melton, Melton. And my father's name was Frank Hitchcock. And as I said earlier, he was born in Murphy, moved to Blue Ridge and then on to Etowah. But my mother was born in Dayton, Ohio. Her father had moved to Dayton, Ohio. He was born here in Tennessee to Aaron Melton and Daphne Melton. And Daphne and Aaron were both former slaves. And my mother lived with Daphne when she was probably about 15 till she was married. And she learned, she remembered all the history that her grandmother told her, and we've recorded that history. So we can share it this weekend. But both her grandparents were former, and great-grandparents were former slaves, and she actually has the names of her grandparents as far back as we can find. And Sylvia and Daphne were living with the Chestnuts on a farm that's on the way to Etowah. And Daphne actually was a slave on the Peck farm, which I think his name was Colonel Peck. He sold a lot of land to the railroad, to build the railroad, the city of Etowah. So we got a deep history in Etowah. And then my father's grandmother was Dovey Fane Hitchcock. And she was born and raised in Murphy, North Carolina, but moved to Etowah, and she's buried in Etowah. We have a copy of a deed where she was deeded by her owner to his daughter. So we have a copy of that deed that was handwritten and then translated into a type print. So our history goes back quite a ways. So it's a Melton and a Hitchcock parents' name.
Is your family's history archived in any other places?
It is specifically Daphne's. Joe Guy's written a story about her as sort of his story. But great-grandma Debbie Melton, her history is also archived in a big book. It's about North Carolina.
Okay.
Yes.
Mine in the Athens area is a lot totally different because being a transplant to the Athens area, we really didn't have deep history in this area. My mother's home was in Jackson, Alabama. So all the family and the history I know from hers was in Jackson, Alabama. My father, he was from Laurel, Mississippi. So you have history from the black communities again in the South. And so since they transitioned and brought us to Athens, Tennessee, probably I would say any Hardaway in this area will be, I guess, an ancestor or some way connected with our family, because my older sister and myself, we were the only ones that came with the family. Had a younger brother, younger sister, but now my younger brother's deceased, but my younger sister's in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I'm the only Hardaway still here, but I have my brother's children, and all of them are still Hardaways. And I have one daughter still here, and but she's now married, so she has Williams. But as far as history for the Hardaway family, it would be pretty much in our area. Those parents are buried here. They're buried here. They're both out at Memorial Gardens in the mausoleum out there.
I've only attended one church all my life. The Mount Olive A.M.E. Zion Church in Etowah. Of course, the A.M.E. Zion Church is a worldwide organization, and we have the Mount Olive Church, which was built in 1910, and I have a copy of that deed, and it has J.W. McDermott on it. That name keeps coming up. But that's the church I've always attended as a child. I was baptized and still do a lot of volunteer work in the church as far as anything that needs to be done. You name it, secretary, officer, whatever.
Even though she comes from another community, but she's still
right. Still go to Etowah Church, yes. Even though I live in Riceville. It was the only church on that side of Etowah, the Baptist church on the east side of Etowah, and the other A.M.E. Zion Church in East Etowah. There's 3 black churches that we attended, but that one is the oldest. It was the mother church of that church was called New Zion, where the cemetery is now. That was a church there, and it was also a school at one point in time. It was when they attended school 5 days a week, or probably 3 or 4 months out of the year, because the other time of the month they had to work on the farm. So New Zion was the first church, and then when it burned somewhere in the early 1900s, and they built the church at Hartstown, because all the people had moved from the farms and followed the railroad, because farming wasn't very profitable back then. You know, everything was by hand, and sometimes it wasn't even their land, but even if they had land, it was hard to do. So young men, when they came back from military, they wanted money and something else to do, so they followed the railroad. They went to town to other industries, and the only industry in Etowah was the railroad, period, for black men.
And was the Parkstown School next to the church, close to the Mount Olive Church?
Yes, it was. It always has been. Even where the park is now, that's where the school used to be.
And about the park, was that always a lively park? I can see that there was a baseball field, a playground. Has it always been like a lively park there?
No, it was where the school was, and there was land around it that we used for playground, for playing ball and stuff, but it wasn't per se a ball field. They used to play softball in the red dirt, because everything in Parkstown is red dirt. And but in I forget what year it was, in the 80s, when the school was deteriorating, we my husband and I were Alan McCloskey and some other people formed a group, and we applied for funding, and the funding included rehabilitation of the houses in Parkstown, plus building a park. And I still have that whole package that I look at every now and then, and I think, wow, they built a house for this. Or they built a park for this, because the park includes a full-size baseball field, a picnic pavilion, a tennis court, and a basketball court, which was really, really significant back in those days. But the sad thing now about the park is there's no kids in Hartstown. I mean, as the generations went along, the whole community is just, there's adults or older people, but there are no children in Parkstown.
Okay, when I moved here, my dad was a Church of God pastor, and so it was in Freehill, and there were a couple of churches in that area. But, so I attended as my father was pastor and all that until I really moved away after undergraduate school and college. Then I moved away and moved out of town, went to Oak Ridge. I would still drive back into Dad's, the church where he was the pastor. Then as years went on, while I did not necessarily want to be a minister, and I ran for 9 years and before I finally accepted, and that happens a lot in the black cultural, I guess, situation. Then I did acknowledge a calling to church, but I pastored a church, in Nashville, Tennessee. Then it was called Bethel Church, independent church, and then I stayed there 8 years, and then we came back to Athens, went back with my dad's church for a number of years, and then I pastored a church in Sweetwater, Tennessee for 19 and a half years. So I've been in a number of church situations, and currently I'm not either pastoring or active as a stable pastor in one, but my wife and I do more church ministry for couples and families. So we have, I guess, sort of support other churches, and many not only local but in surrounding states. We do a lot of work in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and so when we're in town, we'll go to another church. So church has been a major part, as it has been in the black community. It's been a major part of our lives.
I'm trying to think what fond memories I had of school. Teachers were good. I had a first grade teacher, I think, I know who my first grade teacher was. It was Teresa Wilson, and she was ambidextrous. And I think I learned to be ambidextrous following her because she was like a role model. I mean, whatever Teresa Wilson did was good. And I have fond memories of her and in the other school. I guess probably my best memories are after school, because after school we had to wait on the bus to come from Cook High School to bring us, to pick us up and take us home. So we had a lot of playtime after school. We had recess and we had lunch, but it had a lot of fun time after school. And then when I went to, when I was 16, I got my driver's license. So I was probably the only one in the group of, 7 or 8 girls that would drive. And we would all pile into that car, 25 cents a gallon gasoline, and fill the car up, just ride around. That was during high school.
Cruising.
We go to Athens and to Madisonville. And then when I graduated from high school, we thought, oh, let's do big time. Let's go to Cleveland. That was huge for us to drive to Cleveland, because it was my sister's car, and she would let me borrow it because she worked at Bonet, so she would let me borrow the car. And that was probably fond memories, that we would just ride around and look for boys, and teenage years, that's what you do. But I remember back to grammar school, we played. We didn't have a playground. We didn't even have a swing set, but we would play outside and we would make playhouses in the red clay mud. And my biggest memory of grade school was when we were I was in the 3rd grade, because it was our very first year in the new school, and it was a nice school. It had 4 classrooms, bathrooms inside the school. We didn't have to go outside to the bathrooms. It had a gymnasium, a cafeteria/gymnasium. But the first week or so we were in school, it rained a lot, and my brother and another guy, they came back into the school and said, there's a headless man down in the woods, because there was woods down below the school. Yeah. There's a man with his head cut off in the woods. So all the school, the entire school, even one or two of the teachers went down in through the red mud because there was no grass. They went into the woods looking for that headless man. And some of them came back and said, no, before they left, they said, Benny and Larry said there's a man down in the woods with no head. I said, I'm not going because I know both of them lie. And my sister and I didn't go. But the principal was so mad because those beige tiles in that school were totally red mud because it was wet and it stuck to their feet, and they came back and they all got a spanking except for I didn't have mud on my feet, Sue didn't have mud on her feet. Everybody got a spanking, at least one lick, but I didn't because they said Benny and Larry said, and I said, they're lying because I know them. And I wouldn't go. I said, why would I want to go look at a headless man? But that was really significant. They even wrote a story when they did a play in Etowah. They wrote a story about red mud.
Was that displayed at the gym theater?
Yeah, at the gym theater. Yes, I got a video somewhere of that.
Okay.
This is funny.
Interesting. That's a funny story.
Yeah.
What about you? Any interesting, funny?
Well, a lot for school, and as I said, I moved to Athens in second grade. I came from Birmingham, and in the first grade, I was a little bit ahead of a lot of things, and for two reasons. One being maybe the first grade in Alabama in Birmingham. It was an urban area, and plus my older sister was 6 years older than me. And in Birmingham, when she was starting school, Mother wouldn't let me go out in our communities. I mean, and you imagine that in big cities, if I couldn't go out and just play unless she went out. So she would do her schoolwork, and she would give me work to learn how to do some of the things that we did. And so we moved here the summer, going from first grade to second grade. So some of those things that were being taught, possibly in second grade, I'd already learned. So when I came to Athens in the second grade, I was sort of ahead. So some of the things they do, I'd do mine faster and I'd do it quicker. And then I was probably, in our community, probably would be called an ADHD student because I would bother other people or I would talk and got in trouble. I didn't have a lot of trouble, but I would disturb other people. And I can remember in the second grade, they would send me out on the playground. I mean, unsupervised. The teacher had to stay with the kids, but they'd go out and play. And I can remember being out on the playground and cook. We had a merry-go-round and do this thing. So I'd just be out there by myself because I didn't have anybody to help push the merry-go-round. The things that I can remember similar and as interesting as Ann and I think we talked about it once, but when it was time to go to the third grade, they had a number of extra students, so they skipped me from the second to the fourth. So I really didn't go through the third grade, but there was a 4-5 grade split. The teacher that I had for fourth grade also had some in fifth grade, and so I skipped that third grade, and there, as a result of that, graduated a little bit early. But I enjoyed playing with others. You know, my sister and I are 6 years apart in age, but playtime. And in Athens, when we walked, I can remember us talking about walking all the way from Freehill to J.L. Cook Schools. There's a lot of walk time. And we'd do things playing together. So I think it helped you learn how to be relational and play with others. Didn't have a lot of toys or things to play with, as she mentioned. We didn't have a playground, but you could make up things to do. And the old games that you used to play when you had free time. But one of the other things happened with their consolidation. That was part of the civil rights movement when they went to and consolidated, brought the schools together. Now, when they started and went to McMinn Central, because Etowah, Inglewood, and the black students from Cook
Mhm.
all went to McMinn Central in 1966.
Yep.
66 and 67. That was the first year, and then Cook closed in 66, and the black students from the Athens area went to McMinn County High School, and that was the school where I attended my senior year, only 1 year. Their transition with the students in Etowah, consolidating those three schools, Etowah, Inglewood, and the black students from Cook, all went in together in 1966.
Yeah, we didn't have, it was a new school for all of us.
So they
We weren't going into somebody else's school
Yes.
like they did at McMinn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they went together in that school, and they were part of that. At McMinn County High School, we, the black students in Athens, went into the already established situation at
Yeah.
McMinn County High School. And for the seniors, and myself, we were both seniors together, but their experience was much different from ours because they all went in together, and it was not a really challenge. Anytime you have that many students together, there may be little small issues, but they didn't really have the issues there because they all worked, communities worked together to make those things happen. So here we go in McMinn County High School, and as a senior, they pulled us in for the things that it was wanted to. But we as seniors, I didn't get a chance to participate in extracurricular activities like interscholastic sports. The schools had already had their teams picked the year before we did, and I personally, and I don't think my family knew, that we were going to have to go to McMinn County High School, and Cook closed until the summer. When we ended our junior year, I was expecting to come back to J.L. Cook School. And then the summer, it was announced that we would be going to that other school. So that was a transition for us. We already had senior officers. We already had some of the things expected. We were going to do our senior year. So when we went to McMinn, we had to just sort of get into there. So,
Get in where you could get in.
Yeah. But as far football started, before school started, and we showed up, and they said, because they had more than they expected, and especially there had been, much like Ann Boyd went to that school in Etowah, her junior year, we had some of ours that went to McMinn their junior year full time. Now, as a junior, I went to McMinn County High School, walked down the hill. It wasn't that far because I needed to take a foreign language. My sister was already in college, and so by that time we knew if you were going to go to higher ed and go to college, you were probably going to be expected to have a language, and you needed to have some other sciences. At Cook, we had chemistry and we had general science. There was no biology because there was no biology lab. My sister went to college hoping to major and to do something with medicine, biology, but she never had biology, so she really had to struggle. So as a 10th grader, I would walk down in the afternoon and take French and take biology. Then my junior year, I went back and stayed, took everything I needed at Cook because I was not, again, trying to get that school. But our systems of getting involved, getting into extra activities was not that good because I had taken some other classes. When I found out I couldn't play sports, football, as a senior. Now, they did bring in some of the undergrads, classmen later on after school started. But the seniors, there were no seniors that played football nor basketball. We did not get a chance to do other things. And so I can remember when I went to McMinn the early part of the year, it was a trauma, and it was traumatic for me. And when I didn't get a chance to participate in football that I had done at Cook, Then when this basketball team was selected, I didn't get a chance to get there either. I can remember telling my parents, that's not my school. I don't want to go back to that school. It was very traumatic. I was hurt and angry, but my parents were parents that kept us together. But with having both parents, they went to the school, talked to the administrator, talked to the principal, and told them how I basically felt and what was done for me, rather than me get to be in those athletic extracurricular things. They would let me take my classes. I took 3 classes: American history, I took English, as you always, every grade had to take that during those times, and then thirdly, I took a class called co-op, and I started working, and every day I left that school at 10:30. And I got a job at a grocery store, and for me that was it. But I did nothing in that school as a senior, which is usually a good thing for students to do. They're working towards their senior year. But that was a traumatic year for the students in Athens.
Were you have any like friendships, relationships still within the school with other black kids, especially?
With other black kids,
Yeah.
yes, we had relationship with other black kids, and the only thing that was different about going to McMinn County High School, we had some relationship with some of the Caucasian students and white students because we lived in certain areas of town. It was not, we lived in Freehill, yes, but we would still go to the playgrounds and play basketball and things on the playground. So we knew some of the students. We just couldn't go to school together because of segregation policies in the South. Now, some of the northern states did not have it to the same level that we had it.
Probably the Pacific holidays that I remember are Christmas. Of course, we did homecoming at Mount Olive was huge. I mean, the church would be packed, and it was an all-day affair. The homecoming at West Salem in August, we called it the August meeting. That was very memorable because my mother would get up early and cook food. She cooked cakes the day before, and we would pack up a big, huge box, and all of us would pack into that car, and we'd go to West Salem.
Can you explain and tell a little bit more about the history of the West Salem history? Yes.
West Salem, Cumberland Presbyterian Church. It's a historic site, a national historic site. Because it was started, the church actually started in 1866, a year after the Civil War ended. Their ministers, the first ministers were Reverend Jake Armstrong, and he was aided by a white minister, Fate Sloop. But they had brush meetings. They had meetings in a brush arbor, and then they built a log church. And it was burned down, and then they built the wooden church that's still there now. And it was built in the 1940s, but it's still there. We still have homecoming just once a year. And it takes you all the way back to when life was simple. There's no electricity, no lights, no heat, air conditioning. It's hot. On the fourth Sunday in August. It's very hot. But we always try to have a speaker, and before COVID, we had our last West Salem homecoming was August I think it was the 20-something. Anyway, it's the last Sunday in August in 2019, but this year we plan to continue our homecoming. We'll have to open the windows and social distance if we can. And food is served on the ground. There's, people bring food and they stretch it on this long table. You've probably been there before. You know how homecoming is. And it feels like it takes you all the way back to the 1920s or 30s. People are casual. They like each other. They talk to each other. You have a minister that, preaches, and there's singing with no music. And it's a great church. And in 1992, it was listed on was it 1992? No, it was 2001. It was put on the National Register of Historic Places because it is historic. It's kind of the beginning of a lot of people around here. There was the Meltons, the Buchanans, just a whole lot of people came together and built this community church. And it was one of the communities around between Etowah and Athens. And then when young men started moving away and going to Etowah and Athens for jobs, the church quit having meetings. They quit having Sunday service. But they always had Sunday service. They had Sunday school and then church services on Sunday. But during the week, it was a school. And it had this pot-bellied stove in the middle of the, you can still see where the coals are burned all around the floor. There's little divots in the floor where the stove used to sit in the middle of the floor. My mother went to school there because she lived in that area out around Red Hill and Bethsaida. So it's like I said, it kind of takes you back to where things were simple. You know, no phones, no. He raised the windows up, and my brother, when he was living, he brought, and we started that with him, he would bring a generator and plug it in, plug fans in, so we could have some air, but otherwise we would sit there and fan and sweat. But it's really a unique place. And, but that's it.
One of the things too, part of the experiences in our communities were built around. When Cook School was there,
Sure.
it was the center of this entire area. I mean, you would have people that would come, the graduations at Cook School, the major events and community things at Cook School. Well, after Cook School was gone, in the black community, the churches then attempted to try to pick that up and would have, each church would have their homecomings on certain Sundays. I don't know, was Bethsaida, was it the last Sunday in August or one time?
It's the fourth Sunday in August.
It was the fourth Sunday in
Yeah,
August.
sometimes there's 5 Sundays,
Yes.
but it's always the fourth
The fourth
Sunday.
Sunday.
And
most of
was
the
the
time.
third Sunday in
Yeah.
September.
Yeah, so other churches would sort of go around and the church would pick their homecoming.
Mm-hmm.
And people would come to every church's homecoming.
Yeah.
A lot of people would. So it was then the hub of the community church had that. As time has gone on, and one of the things that I think you may think about and see is, I think there was probably a falling away of the culture of the community as cohesive. Part of it being, yes, but none of us had air conditioning. We just go to church and fan, like she said.
Mm-hmm.
But then as time went on, we got to where we got a air conditioner at home, and we could have better TVs and everything. Some churches struggled because people did not come together. There was a time in many communities that most people went to church.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you didn't have necessarily what your relationship with Christ was one thing, but the other piece was church. And so I think as time has gone on, those separate things have polarized our communities, even in the black community. So we have to be intentional and work at making that work.
I think you mentioned social activities. Church used to be like the social hub of the community. We didn't have a lot of clubs and civic organizations. Of course, there was always the NAACP, and there was some private organizations like the Eastern Star and the. As far as social activities, as Vant mentioned, Cook School was the hub in Athens, and Etowah School was the hub in Etowah because you would have plays, you would have singings. Once they built the new school, you had a gym, you could get singers to come in. And they wouldn't necessarily have those at the church, they would have them at the school. They would have, and he mentioned May Day. We would have May Day in Etowah, and Cook students from, I think, the junior high, they would come over because the high school students, you know, they were kind of above us. But I've got pictures from Teresa Wilson's collection showing some May Day activities. And those were like valuable pictures that we've got of May Day. Those were like social events in the community. I mean, he talked about selling hot dogs and snowballs and popcorn.
Yeah.
It was just a tremendous social activity because we didn't have all the clubs and stuff.
Yeah.
Even the NAACP wasn't that active back then.
And then she mentioned the women's organizations, Eastern Star. The men had the Masons. And
The
for
Masons.
some of those groups in the community, I think that was a precursor to when students got to where they could go to the historically black college universities and start fraternities. For those that had not gone through fraternity at college, then they joined the Masons. That was their cohesive group.
Right.
And the same thing for the women group, before some got even starting sororities or whatever they used to start. But the other thing is Ann talked about, and when she started talking about the Wilsons, Teresa Wilson, and she had a sister, Melba. Melba was a sort of dwarf, the person we would call them. You know, we used to use the term midgets, and then we got away from that. But she was, but their father had been a minister, and a lot of the early churches started through their church, the church where they were, the Wilsons. But I can remember with Miss Teresa when they closed those schools, because I didn't know she had been, when I was younger, had been a teacher in Parkstown, when she became then the truant officer for Athens at Cook. She was a truant officer. If kids didn't go to school, Miss Wilson was going to come to see your house and let your parents know you need to be in school. So she had that job.
She was a strict disciplinary,
Yes.
but she was really a great teacher.
And that had a lot of charisma and personality.
Yes.
I mean, for the things she'd say and do. There were things, and I have to say, when we were growing up, the community really fed into, and we developed young people. One of the things we could say at Cook High School, when students graduated from Cook, their classes, the graduating class, what was the average graduating class?
I mean, number of people.
Number of people.
Probably around 15, 20.
20 to 30 students at most.
At most.
And their pictures I know they have. And we need to go back and get
I got
those
one
and
here,
look
right?
at them. But when they went to school, when they graduated from Cook, the principals and the teachers, they positioned us to do something. Most of the students when they left, if they did not go on to higher education in college, if they didn't go to Knoxville College or Morristown College or go to Tennessee A&I State, which is now, Tennessee State University, whichever schools they tended to go to, but those that performed and their families could try to find a way, and they were able and wanted to be an academic, they were going to one school and get there. The others that graduated, many of them already were set for jobs.
Yeah.
Cook School did a good job of being the placement officer or the placement office for students. They could go on to school, and many families, it wasn't many drop out and do nothing. There was a work. There was a work ethic taught. At Cook School, we would have convocation or chapel every week. And very often, if you graduated from Cook, not only were you developed in your class, but you would have to give an oration or give a speech to the entire student body. We would come in, and every student that graduated would have to do some kind, and it was a developmental program, so for a student to get away and never be able to present themselves or talk for the whole group. They felt that, as well as having the chapel to where our administrators or someone would come in and give us a talk about religion or ethics or something. There were some things that just came with the black package. And a lot of our schools use it. I'm glad, there are probably some other people I would rather you would have talked to that came through Cook other than me. But after I graduated from Cook, I was blessed and fortunate to be able to at least go to college. And that happened because of my mother's connection with some of the people she worked in their houses, domestics. But many of those students, when we closed it and we graduated in '67, had to go to the Vietnam War. Military was the only other place for them to go. Many went, and I had a chance to go to college, so I never went into the military service. I admired those that did because that was their source. It helped develop them. But Cook gave them a plan to go on and do some other things. And sometimes right now, especially when families are not in churches or in something, unless those parents really take it serious, we miss developing certain students. So there are students that maybe will go to Berea, and I don't know how, but Precious is one that I followed because I went on to do higher ed, and I got to be a teacher and a coach and go on. And I say we still have to do that. If somebody doesn't take up the mantle and help develop our youngsters, NAACP has done that. There's a women's organization, Women United in Community Service, that have attempted to do some of those things. So someone has to be challenged to help develop that. Because if we just go on through it, I can give you a quote, Precious. I can remember one of the teachers at Cook. They said to me, Vant Hardaway, you're going to learn certain skills, whether it be math. I can remember a geometry teacher said, you're going to get this because when you get on out of here, you're going to need it. Well, sometimes now, and I won't say who, but because those teachers knew our parents, they had history with us, they took it personal to develop those students, and they did not want us to fail, but they did. And as time has gone on, we just don't have that. The principal, Mr. Harvard Johnson, Dr. Nash, I heard her mention Mr. Nash, who started Cook, but he had students coming from North Carolina and other states that would come and stay on weekends because some other states didn't have those programs like Cook did in this high school. But for myself, I wanted to be a professional, and my male teachers were role models for me. It was either be a principal, be a preacher, or be a teacher. And I can call the names, and I will start calling because I'll miss somebody. But those models help me.
Most of the time, I feel like the church is probably your one source of bringing together the community. Like the events that we just had, the Juneteenth is a really, really good way to bring together the community. You have to have events that people are interested in, like the Dream Achievers. That brought together a lot of community, just to see their child or grandchild or whatever receive an award. It's, used to a singings in the church, a concert or whatever would bring together people. But I don't know that that's a big draw anymore because people can do other things. They don't necessarily think that the church is essential. Yeah, it's essential. They could, there's so many other ways to go to church now. They can pick up a YouTube or, sit at home in the pajamas and watch a sermon or hear a sermon. But I still think that they miss the fellowship of a church, because without that fellowship, you don't have that cohesion that brings you together as a community. And a lot of our communities are losing that. And I'm not really sure how we can get it back, but we keep trying. The longer a church stays open, maybe, people will start to come. The pandemic moved a lot of people away from in-person worship, and they, just said, we'll stay home. We even did online worship as far as using teleconference and video conference. But it's, a lot of people have just got comfortable with that. They blame the pandemic, or they just don't blame anything. They just don't come. And it's really kind of different to get people to come together. Even a funeral doesn't necessarily bring people. Usually you have a funeral, the church will be packed, but it's, it's mostly family, so, which is the reason why we're having a reunion this weekend, so.
Well, and then if I can just piggyback a little bit on that, I think there's a constant challenge of individuals that see it to continue want to work. And it's almost like each one reach one. I just personally have a commitment to really develop and have someone to say, hey, that child, and one of the things it is doing, and I would say right now, and I don't know who all will see this interview, I want to affirm you for doing this so that people can hear and see that, and periodically we see these things, but hopefully we will say in communities, let's look at and talk about the challenge that has to come, because I'm going to say personally, I think it is a challenge for young men and boys and young people like the young lady, Princess, that's the Precious, that is developing this, to want to do that, but somebody has to stay behind.
Yeah.
In your families. And when you were mentioning about the reunions or whatever, families need to make sure we do that. Right now, there is so much division and polarization that we need to pull that back together. The families coming together will help do that. I personally, with the Hardaway family, the family I'm with, we started 2 years ago because I had a cousin that was very close to me. We were the same age, born the same year, about 4 months apart, passed away as a result of COVID. And when we started, she got sick. We started, her daughters and others, we started having a prayer call, which is again like virtual, what churches have done. And as of right now, 2 years plus, we're over 2 years away. We started in March of that year praying that she would live, and she did transition. But right now, every Friday evening, there's a group. We did it with just a conference call. We were praying, but now we just relate to each other and talk about it. I have some in Indiana, Ohio, and other areas, Tennessee, and we will have for 30 minutes to an hour prayer call. We talk about those things and try to keep family close together. And we just have to do that. And I think we need to do that within the community. I'm proud to be in here with Ms. Boyd, who was for 16 years, I think, and I may cut her short a little bit, president of the NAACP, because it was hard to get people to take that office. Volunteerism struggles right now.
Yes.
But I mean, to have officers, and you would have groups that are trying to do positive things. If we don't do that, and I'm an ex-teacher, coach, I'm a principal, I did not become a principal, but a pastor, and to get people that will give to the next generation. So I commend her for the service and the example she's walked through. I mean, she's a walking, she and some others are sort of a clearinghouse for information in this community, because there's some, I don't know, I was a transplant in here, but we need to do that. Now we have to move it on to the next. And I thank you for what you do.
Yeah. Wonderful job.
Thank you.